The history of Netflix is one of the most fascinating stories, but things were nearly very different. At one point, Netflix was a small DVD rental service on the verge of going out of business, and they were desperately trying to sell their company to their biggest competitor, Blockbuster. However, Blockbuster turned their offer down and laughed them out the room. Fast forward a couple of decades, and Blockbuster have long since gone bankrupt, whilst Netflix went on to be worth over $200 billion, win countless prestigious awards, and completely revolutionize entertainment. So how did they do it? And most importantly, why is Netflix now in very deep trouble? Mark Randolph was sure of one thing: he wanted to start his own internet business. He'd seen the huge success Amazon was having selling books online and felt there was a huge opportunity with this new internet thing. The only problem was that he had no clue what business to start. For months, everywhere Mark went, he carried around a little notebook to write ideas in, and he then pitched them to his friend Reed. How about we sell personalized surfboards, dog food, baseball bats? Mark had endless ideas of things they could sell, but Reed always just shook his head and said that'll never work. After Mark had gone through more than 100 ideas, Reed said they should instead try to find something that people will pay for repeatedly. So once you found a customer, you'll be able to sell to them over and over again. Reed also said they should stay away from customizable items, because then every new order requires additional work, so it's not as scalable. Mark considered this and then threw out one final suggestion. How about videotapes? For the first time, Reed didn't immediately dismiss the idea. Instead, he looked out the window, seemingly deep in thought, and eventually said, maybe. Now, here's the thing. Right before Mark had mentioned videotapes, Reed had just been fined a $40 late fee by Blockbuster for returning a movie late. Reed thought to himself that perhaps movie rentals was the industry in need of a change. Perhaps this could be their big business idea, renting out movies via the internet. It's perfect, right? Wrong. As soon as Mark and Reed thought about the idea some more, reality started to sink in. Remember, this was 1997, where people were using VHS tapes, which were very bulky to ship, and this had pretty high postage costs. So they'd be at a huge disadvantage compared to physical video rental stores who didn't have to pay postage. Not to mention the high risk of the tapes getting damaged in the mail. It started to become clear to both Mark and Reed the business idea was dead before it had even begun. At least, it was until a few weeks later, when Reed was reading an article in a tech magazine about a new technology called DVDs, which would solve most of the issues that VHS tapes had. DVDs were much smaller and lighter, meaning they were easier and cheaper to ship. In fact, they could be posted with just a regular stamp for 32 cents. Plus, DVDs were much cheaper to buy and easier to store, so Reed felt the business model of renting out DVDs could work much better than VHS tapes. And since it was a brand new technology, nobody else was doing it yet. Admittedly, neither Mark nor Reed had ever actually seen a DVD before. Prior to 1997, DVDs were only available in Japan, but both of them had liked the idea of bringing movie rentals onto the internet, especially Reed, who just received yet another hefty late fine from Blockbuster. And so this new DVD technology seemed like it could be the answer. They were essentially betting big that DVDs would become more mainstream and the default standard instead of VHS tapes. And thus, the original idea for Netflix was born. The business model was fairly simple. Mark and Reed would buy a big collection of DVDs and create a website where people could rent them out for a small fee each. After a customer placed an order, they'd mail them the DVD of their choice in a protective sleeve, and it'd be at their doorstep in a couple of days. Once they'd watched it, the customer would simply put the DVD into a prepaid return envelope that was included with the order and send it back. So, now they had their business idea, they needed some money to fund it. Luckily, Reed already had some of his own money to invest from a previous business venture, but Mark couldn't really afford to put much money in himself, so he instead turned to his mother, who became one of Netflix's earliest investors. Of course, she only invested because she wanted to support her son, yet that initial investment would go on to make her insanely wealthy. By the end of 1997, Mark and Reed had used their initial money to get a little office and hire a small team. Admittedly, it was all very low budget. They had just a few cheap folding tables, along with old secondhand furniture, and the employees they'd hired were working for well below average wages. But they promised them stock options, meaning those early employees would get a big big payout if Netflix succeeded. Although initially, none of the team wanted the company to be called Netflix. The word Flix had a pretty negative, low-quality connotation, so they all came up with other name ideas like Luna, Cinema Center, Now Showing, Scene 1, and Videopix. But eventually, they all decided it would make sense to have a name that would combine one word related to the internet and one word related to movies. And since Netflix hit that criteria, plus it was short and kinda catchy, eventually they just went with that and the name stuck. The small Netflix team then spent the next few months building their website and buying multiple copies of literally every DVD they possibly could. Since the DVD format was still new, there were only around 800 titles available because a lot of movie studios hadn't been releasing their films on DVD yet. But Netflix tracked them all down so they could legitimately claim to have every DVD that had been made. Of course, they pretty much just had to guess how many copies of each movie to buy based on what they thought might be popular. But finally, after months of work and planning and questioning whether this idea was totally insane or not, they were ready to launch Netflix to the world. It was time for the madness to begin. It was 8:56 AM, and to say that the small Netflix team were nervous would be a ridiculous understatement. Mark could feel beads of sweat on his forehead as he checked the clock once again. At 9 AM, they would make the Netflix website publicly accessible to the world. The team had been preparing for this moment for months. They'd even lined up a bunch of interviews with news outlets and reporters so that as soon as they put the website live, they'd get lots of media attention to introduce people to their new service. However, the biggest reason for their anxiety was none of them had any idea how many orders to expect. It could be 0, it could be 10, it could be hundreds. At 9 AM on the dot, one of the engineers made a few clicks on his computer and the Netflix site was officially live. They'd hooked up a bell to the computer so it would ring whenever they got a new sale. And so, to get the ball rolling, Mark himself placed the first ever order on Netflix. He rented a copy of Casino and entered his details to get it shipped to his home address. The bell rang and Netflix were in business. A minute later, the bell rang again, and again. And again. These were now real customers, strangers somewhere on the internet who were ordering DVDs for themselves. You see, in the weeks leading up to the website launch, the Netflix team had infiltrated online forums and bulletin boards for movie fans and started building up profiles on these sites as if they were normal users. Then, as soon as the Netflix website launched, they started making comments like, "Anyone try out that new DVD by mail company yet? Netflix? Looks like they have hundreds of DVDs. Prices are pretty good too." Obviously, they gave no indication they worked for Netflix. And so people on these forums just thought it was genuine comments, which helped drive some movie fans to the Netflix website right from day one. Mark was excited and went off to the other room in the office to do his scheduled interviews with the media to help drum up even more publicity for Netflix's launch. And for 15 glorious minutes, the orders continued to roll in. But then Mark noticed the bell had stopped ringing, meaning the orders had stopped coming in. And it soon became clear from the worried expressions from everyone else in the office, something had gone horribly wrong. Turns out they'd had too much traffic, and their website had crashed. Remember, this was long before the days of cloud hosting, where you could instantly just add more servers and bandwidth. Back in 1998, you had servers physically in your office to host your website. Netflix hadn't bought enough of them, so someone had to run to the electronics store nearby to buy some more servers. They'd simply not expected demand to be this high on day one. Of course, it was a good problem to have. But it was also incredibly stressful. All that work over the last few months preparing to launch, and now just 15 minutes in and people couldn't even access their websites. And there was no guarantee those people would check back again later. Mark's mind was racing, thinking of all the potential customers they were losing out on because of this. When one of their employees returned from the store with 8 new servers, they got the website back online. This time, the website lasted 45 minutes before it crashed yet again. Not just that, the Netflix team ran out of boxes to ship the DVDs, and they ran out of ink to print the shipping labels. Despite all the chaos though, they finished the first day with 137 orders, which was far higher than anyone had expected. And they'd have almost certainly had even more orders if the site hadn't been crashing most of the day. So it was an incredibly promising start for the company. Of course, it was clear there was a huge amount of work ahead. There were several massive things they'd completely overlooked, like they hadn't set up automatic order confirmations, so the team was manually emailing everyone who placed an order. Plus, they hadn't even thought about how to handle international orders to other countries. And of course, the most urgent issue of all, simply trying to stop the site from crashing. The Netflix team knew they'd be working very late that night, so they ordered pizza, feeling optimistic about their new company. Of course, at that moment, not a single one of the Netflix team could have possibly predicted what would happen next. In On Netflix's first full month after launching, their revenue passed $94,000. However, only $1,000 had actually come from renting DVDs. The rest was all from selling DVDs. You see, when Netflix first launched, they gave people both options. You could buy the DVD for around $25 or rent it for $4. And Mark and Reed had expected most people would rent. In fact, they hadn't just expected people to rent, they needed people to rent. The business model of renting out DVDs was much better because Netflix could rent out the same DVD over and over again hundreds of times and thus make far more money in the long run. But weirdly, hardly anyone was choosing to rent from Netflix. People were just buying the DVDs as a one-time transaction. Now sure, it was great they were making lots of DVD sales, but it wasn't sustainable. As soon as other large companies started selling the exact same DVDs as Netflix, they would become a commodity, as everyone would be selling identical products. So Netflix's profit margins would shrink and their sales would decrease. The only reason Netflix was selling so many DVDs in their first month was simply because nobody else had started selling DVDs on the internet yet. But Mark and Reed knew for a fact that other companies would soon start doing it. So basically, Netflix needed people to start renting more DVDs instead, because then they'd have higher profit margins and a business model that was harder to replicate, meaning they could build up a loyal customer base before anyone else. Funnily enough, just a few weeks later, in the summer of 1998, Mark and Reed got a call from Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. He wanted to meet them. Bezos had started Amazon as an online bookstore, but now he'd decided he wanted to build an everything store, and he was eyeing up DVDs as one of the next products Amazon could start selling. Since Amazon was pretty flush with cash after going public, Jeff was looking at the possibility of acquiring Netflix and integrating it into Amazon. In many ways, this was win-win for both sides. For Amazon, it would be much faster for them to get into the DVD market by buying Netflix instead of starting completely from scratch. And for Mark and Reed, it would mean they get a huge chunk of money for just a few months of work. Plus, they knew if they didn't sell Netflix to Amazon, it was only a matter of time before they were in direct competition with them. There was just one problem though. Mark and Reed didn't want to sell Netflix. They really felt there was huge potential with the online DVD rental idea, and they just devoted the last few months of their life to building a great small team, a working website, and the largest collection of DVDs. They were just getting started. So Mark and Reed declined Bezos' offer to buy Netflix. However, on the plane ride back home after meeting with Amazon, Mark and Reed came to another realization. Offering both DVD sales and rentals on the same website was probably overcomplicating things too much. It was basically like running two separate businesses. And it was confusing to customers as well. Both Mark and Reed strongly agreed renting DVDs was the business they actually wanted to be in. So instead of selling their entire company to Amazon, they came up with a deal. Once Amazon started selling DVDs, Netflix would redirect their users who wanted to buy DVDs to Amazon's websites. And in return, Amazon would direct customers to Netflix, advertising it as a way for customers to rent DVDs. In theory, this could solve everything. A partnership with Amazon would massively boost Netflix's profile, it would keep Amazon as a friend, not an enemy, and most importantly, it would mean Netflix could solely focus on DVD rentals, which is the business model Mark and Reed actually wanted to pursue, and that they felt would work best long term. But remember, in the first 2 months Netflix had been running so far, almost all of the money Netflix had made had come from selling DVDs, not renting. So Netflix were about to ditch the part of their business that was actually working well. What could possibly go wrong? In order to get more people renting DVDs from Netflix, Mark made a deal with some of the biggest manufacturers of DVD players, like Toshiba and Sony. The plan was that whenever someone bought a DVD player, if they entered the product's serial number on the Netflix website, Netflix would let them rent some DVDs for free. In theory, it made sense, because as a new customer bought a DVD player, they'd immediately sign up for Netflix for this promotion to get the free DVD rentals, and then hopefully get hooked on the service and become paying customers. But in reality, it was an absolute disaster. Netflix initially offered 3 free DVD rentals to anyone who bought a DVD player, but Sony pushed Netflix to make it 10 free rentals instead. This was really expensive for Netflix, but they desperately needed customers, so they agreed. The problems then began when the Netflix team noticed they'd ship loads of free DVDs to the exact same address. It turns out, Sony had put the serial numbers for their DVD players on the outside of the boxes, which meant anyone could see the serial number without actually buying the DVD player. As a result, people could go into their local electronics store, video. Simply look at the small print on the bottom of the DVD player boxes, and then claim 10 free DVDs from Netflix with every single serial code. In other words, the promotion was getting abused, and Netflix were getting ripped off. But it gets worse. Even with the legitimate customers who actually had bought a DVD player, once they'd redeemed their free DVDs, they never went back to the Netflix websites. People would claim the free ones from the promotion, but less than 5% became regular paying Netflix customers. So although the promotion most definitely increased the amount of DVDs Netflix sent out, it was costing them huge amounts of money with very little to show for it. Netflix realized they needed to try a new promotion idea, and this time they decided to go for a publicity stunt. Congress had just released the full footage of Bill Clinton's grand jury testimony, where he went into detail about his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. This was an event all of America was talking about, and lots of people wanted to see the footage of the trial. So Netflix decided to convert the video footage onto DVD format and give it away on their website for just 2 cents, with the tagline, "Have your 2 cents on the Clinton testimony." Just as Netflix had hoped, many newspapers wrote about the promotion, giving Netflix the free publicity they needed. And at first, it seemed like a big marketing success. For just a few $1,000s, Netflix attracted thousands of new customers to their website. But then once again, things went wrong. You see, Netflix had partnered with a company to help them convert the videotape of the Clinton trial onto DVD, and then make lots of copies of it. But it turns out that the company was also offering a similar service to people making adult movies. And somehow, whilst creating these Bill Clinton discs for the Netflix promotion, they accidentally mixed some of the adult movies in with the Clinton discs. Since all the DVDs were unlabeled, nobody realized about the mix-up until Netflix had already sent some of their users some pretty hardcore stuff. Of course, as soon as Netflix realized about the mix-up, they sent an email apologizing to everyone who'd signed up for this promotion, and asked that people return the explicit DVDs so Netflix could send them the proper Bill Clinton DVD as they'd advertised. Although, funnily enough, not a single person returned it. However, all of this didn't change the fact that Netflix was hemorrhaging money. None of their promotions were leading to returning customers, and the deal they'd made with Amazon wasn't going well either. Netflix had sent them loads of traffic, but Amazon wasn't sending many customers back towards Netflix. Things were all looking quite bleak, and Mark couldn't help wondering, should we have just sold to Amazon when we had the chance? Or should we have stuck with selling DVDs instead of renting them? And then things got even worse. Reed pulled Mark aside and said, "I'm worried about us. Actually, I'm worried about you, about your judgment." Now remember, Reed and Mark were both co-founders of Netflix. Reed had put up most of the money, but hadn't been as active within the company. Meanwhile, Mark was running the company as CEO, devoting most of his time to it. However, Reed opened his laptop to a PowerPoint he'd prepared and began to explain some of the many issues he felt Netflix was having. Reed tried to explain as politely as he could that he was concerned about Mark's recent choices. For example, some of his decisions with promotions, hiring, and the finances of the company, which admittedly were in a pretty bad state. Reed had always been pretty blunt and direct, but this presentation completely caught Mark off guard. He was furious. Was Reed seriously going to give him a presentation on all the ways Mark was failing as a CEO? Reed eventually ended by saying he wanted to become the Netflix CEO, and that Mark should move to the role of president. He said they'd be a team working together, but Reed should have the official CEO title. Mark was completely overwhelmed by all this. He was angry. He was hurt. He considered Reed not just a co-founder, but a good friend, and this felt like a betrayal. But the worst part of all for Mark was that he knew Reed was right. Even though Mark had been essential in getting Netflix started, Reed simply had a lot more experience of running a company compared to Mark. And since Reed had a very good reputation in the tech industry after selling his previous business, he knew that Reed being CEO would be more popular with investors and help them get more attention and funding. After Mark had calmed down and rationalized the whole thing, he accepted. His job title wasn't that important to him anyway, and he'd still be heavily involved in any big decisions. Plus, he felt with Reed now giving Netflix 100% of his focus, they had a better shot of making this work. Of course, making Reed CEO wasn't magically going to fix all their problems. The reality was they were still struggling to get enough customers renting DVDs from them for the business to be profitable. Mark went for a run to clear his mind and try to process everything. And whilst he was running, an idea struck him. An idea that might just change everything. Up until this point, Netflix had basically just been doing the same thing as Blockbuster, but on the internet, and renting DVDs instead of VHS tapes.
Wow.
But then Mark thought, instead of people renting individual movies one at a time and keeping them for just a couple of days, what if Netflix completely ditched the return dates and late fees and instead offered a recurring subscription plan for a flat monthly rate? You'd get 4 DVDs at a time, and whenever you were done with a film, you'd simply swap it for a different one. But you'd always have some movies at your home, meaning you had complete flexibility of when to watch things and when to swap the DVDs for new ones. It was perfect, because before this change, Blockbuster had a clear advantage over Netflix. If you wanted to watch a movie, you could just drive down to their physical stores, unlike Netflix where you had to wait 2 or 3 days for the DVD to ship. But with this new Netflix subscription model, where there were no set return dates and no late fees, it meant customers could always keep a few movies at their home so they were ready to watch instantly whenever the mood struck. So you didn't have to plan things out in advance. Reed loved the idea too, and once Netflix switched to this subscription model, immediately their popularity grew. On the first day they introduced this offer, 90% of people who saw it signed up to the subscription plan. That's an insanely high conversion number. Things were suddenly starting to look up for Netflix. Not only did they now have a better business model, but DVDs were starting to become more mainstream, and DVD players had started to get much cheaper, which of course all led to more interest in Netflix. And thus, their subscribers started to grow more and more every month. And because the subscription automatically renewed each month, these were repeat customers, so their revenue was growing rapidly as well. However, things got even better for Netflix when they started developing an algorithm to match the right DVDs to the right people. Netflix had realized that as they added more and more DVDs to their collection, it was important users could easily find movies they liked. Not only would it make users more likely to renew their subscription each month, but Netflix wanted a way for people to discover movies that were cheaper for the company to buy. Because if everyone was just renting the newest, most in-demand DVDs, it would be more expensive for the company. But a recommendation algorithm would help people find DVDs specific to their tastes. So Netflix developed an algorithm called Cinematch to pick up on patterns between users who watch similar things. They also started asking users to rate the movies they watched, to help their prediction algorithm understand what each individual was enjoying, and what to recommend more of. Once again, this gave Netflix another advantage over competitors. So after several rocky years of changing their business model multiple times, Netflix were now finally on track. And then...
It's described as nothing short of breathtaking, a points drop never before seen on the US market. This closing bell might as well have been an alarm, so savage was the selling.
For an internet-based company that was investing heavily in growth, the dot-com crash was a disaster. Funding for internet companies completely dried up, and the sentiment towards internet businesses changed. As a result, Mark and Reed had to take some drastic action. Although Netflix had started gaining a lot more customers since switching to their subscription plan model, the company was still tiny compared to their biggest movie rental rival, Blockbuster. Whilst Netflix was on track to make around $5 million in revenue in 2000, Blockbuster made nearly $800 million in revenue in late fees alone. And Blockbuster was valued at around $6 billion and had around 60,000 employees. This was truly David versus Goliath. Netflix had just one thing in its favour. Blockbuster had been extremely slow to react to the rise of the internet. Blockbuster seemed to have the mantra, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so they'd stuck with their physical stores and did things the way they always had. The problem for Netflix was that they knew eventually Blockbuster was likely to launch their own DVD by mail subscription service once it became clear that more and more people were switching to Netflix. Now, before the dot-com bubble burst and internet stock prices came crashing down, investors were throwing money at any companies that had .com in their name. And easy funding meant it would be possible for Netflix to invest heavily in growth and get a massive head start before Blockbuster or any other big companies started copying their idea. But after the dot-com bubble burst, no investors wanted to go anywhere near a business with .com in their name. And so getting the funding Netflix needed for their big expansion plans suddenly seemed impossible. However, Mark and Reed had an idea to save the company. Maybe Blockbuster would want to buy Netflix. It seemed like a win-win. A win for Mark and Reed because they could essentially continue running Netflix but be backed by Blockbuster's huge resources, working as a team rather than competitors. And it would be a win for Blockbuster because they'd immediately be able to kickstart their online business and give their customers an alternative option. So Reed used some of his contacts to try and arrange a meeting with Blockbuster. And for a while, they didn't hear anything back at all. Netflix weren't sure if Blockbuster even knew who they were, but weeks later, they had a call to say Blockbuster could meet with them the following morning. It was extremely short notice, but Mark and Reed dropped everything, got on a plane, and went to meet the Blockbuster CEO. The meeting was intimidating, especially as Blockbuster had most of the power in the negotiations. But Reed and Mark explained why Blockbuster and Netflix should join forces, how together they could dominate in-store and online movie rentals. The Blockbuster CEO heard them out, listening patiently, but eventually he said that he felt the dot-com hysteria was overblown, and that online business models like Netflix just weren't sustainable. Finally he asked, out of curiosity, what price are you looking to sell Netflix for? Reed had rehearsed this line in his head and replied, $50 million.
And basically they laughed at us. They laughed at us because of the hubris that in the heat of a dot-com meltdown, this upstart direct mail video business would dare be worth $50 million. And it was crushing.
The Blockbuster CEO tried to hide his smirk, but it was immediately clear to Reed and Mark that Blockbuster had no interest in buying Netflix, and he thought their valuation was a joke. Mark and Reed left the meeting feeling devastated and extremely anxious about whether Netflix was even gonna survive. One thing was clear though, if Blockbuster didn't want to buy Netflix, then Netflix somehow had to beat Blockbuster. The struggling internet startup somehow had to take down the multi-billion-dollar empire. It was time for David to beat Goliath. Since Netflix knew money was going to be a lot tighter, they had to lay off a third of their employees. However, something interesting happened once they did this. They seemed to get more work done with less people. They'd kept only their best employees, their star players, and as a result, the company became leaner and more efficient, more focused and decisive. Plus, their service was genuinely popular with customers, so it seemed like Netflix might just about make it through these difficult economic times. But of course, to have any hope of competing with Blockbuster, they still needed money. And so in 2002, Netflix had its IPO, which is where a company starts selling their shares to the public on the stock market as a way to raise more money.
Netflix made a spectacular debut on the NASDAQ stock market today.
The next couple of years saw great growth for Netflix, which inevitably attracted Blockbuster's attention.
Blockbuster realized after we went public that we were going to be a real threat, and they geared up an effort. They launched in 2004, and from 2004 to 2007, we had a very fun, scary, epic battle with Blockbuster.
It took until 2004 for Blockbuster to eventually launch their own streaming website with a DVD by mail rental service exactly like Netflix had. And from that moment on, the two companies were in very direct competition. However, Mark Randolph, Netflix's co-founder and original CEO, would not be joining for the battle with Blockbuster. Ever since Reed's PowerPoint, where Reed took over as CEO, things had been a little different. Mark's responsibilities at the company had decreased, and he felt a little out of place. The original Netflix team of 8 employees had now become a team of hundreds. And whilst the growth was great, Mark missed those early startup days. The tight-knit family working together to solve all kinds of different challenges. Mark missed the spontaneity of every day being something totally different when you're a startup. And thus, Mark decided to step away from Netflix and instead focus on helping other small startups in their very early stages. So Reed was left to run Netflix himself, and he was well aware that the battle with Blockbuster was going to be brutal, especially now that Blockbuster was essentially offering the exact same DVD by mail service as Netflix, as well as having their physical stores too. And remember, even though Blockbuster had been so slow to adapt, Blockbuster was still a much larger company than Netflix, and thus they had a bigger budget to spend. In an interview at the time, Reed said that Blockbuster was throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them. And so the next day, the Blockbuster CEO literally sent a kitchen sink to Netflix's office. Seriously, the message was simple. Blockbuster finally saw the threat of Netflix and were going to put everything they could into beating them. So Netflix initially thought the solution to this was to experiment with a bunch of new features to try and differentiate themselves from Blockbuster's new copycat DVD by mail service. Firstly, Netflix created their own social network called Netflix Friends, where you could share with your friends what you were watching and see each other's movie ratings and recommendations. Netflix also experimented with other ways to make money, like selling discounted used DVDs, selling banner advertising on their websites, and even buying the movie rights to some small films from Sundance and other film festivals, and then putting them onto DVDs so they owned the content. Unfortunately, none of these new initiatives really helped Netflix much at all, and Reed quickly came to the realization that they were spreading themselves too thin by focusing on all these new ideas.
In hindsight, we realized when attacked, we should retreat to do the core better and not try to broaden the surface of attack, essentially. So now when people say, aren't you getting into news or sports? We're like, absolutely not.
In other words, Netflix realized their best chance of success was to be laser focused on improving their core business and not getting distracted by other ideas. Blockbuster, on the other hand, did not come to that realization. They started experimenting with totally new services, like renting out video games as well as movies. Meanwhile, Netflix stayed focused on movies and TV shows, and most importantly, they continued to look to the future. Even though by this point they were shipping out over 1 million DVDs by mail every day, it had become clear to the Netflix team that DVDs could not be their end game. Internet speeds were getting faster and faster, and in 2007, Netflix decided to launch a video-on-demand service, or in other words, letting people stream movies and TV shows over the internet. Netflix took some inspiration from YouTube for this, but to Netflix's credit, nobody else had properly attempted to stream entire TV shows and movies over the internet like this before, so it was a big move. Now, initially, Netflix's library of content they had the rights to stream over the internet was very small, and so they kept their DVD rental subscriptions as well. The streaming site was more like an added bonus for subscribers, and a way to differentiate themselves from Blockbuster. But Netflix knew that as internet speeds got faster, eventually they'd ditch DVDs completely and focus solely on streaming. The great news for Netflix though was that back then, they were the only streaming company, and so it was relatively cheap for them to get licenses to use other people's content as there was no competition. In fact, they made a great deal with a company called Starz for $20 million, which gave them the rights to stream a huge library of popular content, including Disney and Sony movies. Netflix also made deals with Xbox, PlayStation, TiVo, and Apple, so that it was easy for people to watch Netflix's streaming service on their TVs and other devices, since this was before the days where everyone had a smart TV with apps on. But most importantly, by launching this new streaming service, it allowed Netflix to begin expanding internationally. Up until this point, Netflix had really just focused on the US market, because the business model of sending out DVDs by mail meant they were relying on the US Postal Service, and entering other countries would have meant whole new logistical challenges to ship out the DVDs. But with this new streaming site they'd launched, Netflix could now pretty easily enter any country in the world, since they didn't have to ship anything physical. Meanwhile, Netflix also continued to invest heavily in their recommendation algorithm to match users to the right content, because they'd realized that their previous rating system wasn't actually the best way to understand what customers really wanted.
Everyone would rate Schindler's List 5 stars, and then they'd rate Adam Sandler, The Do-Over 3 stars. Okay, but in fact, when you looked at what they watched, it was almost always Adam Sandler. Okay, and so what happens is when we rate and we're metacognitive about quality, that's sort of our aspirational self. And it works out much better to please people to look at the actual choices that they make.
So in 2007, Netflix ran a public contest called the Netflix Prize, where they offered $1 million reward for the best prediction algorithm to help match users to the right content. The contest was open to anyone at all, and so it not only helped Netflix get a better recommendation algorithm, but it was great marketing for the company too, because lots of new customers heard about Netflix because of this $1 million competition they ran. Over the years, Netflix would continue to invest in trying to personalize their service to each user. For example, nowadays, different users see different thumbnails on Netflix's websites based on what Netflix's algorithms think someone is more likely to click on, using all the data they have about a user's viewing preferences. However, whilst Netflix were making a lot of good decisions, in the mid-2000s, Blockbuster was also busy trying to promote its DVD by mail rental service to try and win back some of the customers they'd lost to Netflix. Blockbuster even decided to ditch their late fees like Netflix had done.
No more late fees! No more late fees!
However, Blockbuster got a little greedy here. Whilst they did scrap late fees for people who returned movies late, they changed it so that if you didn't bring the movie back within a week of the date you were given, they automatically charged you the full price of buying the movie and said it was yours to keep whether you wanted it or not. So they tried to spin it like they were making a really great improvement to their service like Netflix had done, but it came across as a bit of a greedy cash grab. Blockbuster also had rewind fees if you'd forgotten to rewind your VHS tape back to the beginning when you returned it. Basically, it seemed like Blockbuster's strategies to make more money often involved giving the customer a worse experience or squeezing money out of them, whereas Netflix back then tried to make more money by improving the customer experience. Gradually, more and more customers started to drift over to Netflix, especially after Netflix had launched their streaming site, which was ultimately just way more convenient than renting DVDs by mail or in physical stores. And thus, by 2010, Blockbuster had filed for bankruptcy.
Video rental chain Blockbuster has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Blockbuster has been synonymous with the home video market, but has been losing money and market share for years. Competition from the likes of Netflix and Redbox weighed on the retailer dependent on its brick-and-mortar infrastructure.
But why exactly did Netflix beat Blockbuster? And are there any lessons we can learn here? Well, clearly Blockbuster was consistently slow to react to changes in technology. Netflix was proactive about innovation, Blockbuster was extremely reactive, and repeatedly failed to adapt until it was too late, leaving them stuck in the past.
Really, if they had started 2 years earlier, they probably would have won, in perfect hindsight, because they would have just even though it was messy execution, they would have overwhelmed us.
Blockbuster was too busy making money with their current business model to realize how fast things were changing with the internet, and Netflix was always a few steps ahead. Plus, the big issue for Blockbuster was that they'd expanded so rapidly and had so many physical stores, which meant they were terribly positioned to act quickly to technological changes. All that expensive real estate Blockbuster had, which had once been their big advantage, had become their biggest weakness once things started going online. In Blockbuster's defense, this type of thing isn't uncommon. Many big companies can't adapt quickly enough when their industry shifts. Think about how dominant Nokia once were in mobiles, or Kodak in photography. But companies get stuck doing things a certain way and are too bloated and bureaucratic to react quickly to changes. So a new leaner startup innovates and takes their place. And that's why Netflix deserves some credit here. Once they'd finally got things running so well with their DVD subscription service, it would have been tempting to stick with that, but instead they started focusing on streaming instead. And throughout Netflix's entire history they've been like this, like when they stopped selling DVDs to focus on rentals, or when they stopped normal rentals to focus on their subscription plan. Rather than be content with what was working, they kept trying to improve. And this was largely down to their extremely unique and bizarre culture, which we're going to look at very shortly. But for Blockbuster's management, they must surely look back and think of how differently things could have gone if they'd just made a few better decisions. Like in 1999, Blockbuster was approached by Enron to make a video-on-demand streaming service pretty similar to the one Netflix would make 8 years later. Blockbuster could have dominated the streaming industry if they'd listened to this advice and been the first ones to launch a streaming service. As this article points out, at essentially zero cost to itself, Blockbuster had been handed a video-on-demand infrastructure, and yet because they were doing so well as they were and were unwilling to adapt to a new business model, the deal never went ahead. As if that wasn't bad enough, remember as well that in 2000, Netflix literally turned up at Blockbuster's office trying to sell their company to Blockbuster for just $50 million, which was virtually nothing to Blockbuster, who were worth billions at the time, but they laughed them out the room. Of course, if Blockbuster had bought Netflix, they'd have probably stifled all the innovation anyway, so there's no guarantee Netflix would have gone on to become what it is today. But still, with hindsight, it's crazy how different things would have been if Blockbuster bought Netflix when they had the chance. Having said all of that though, it should be acknowledged that technically, Blockbuster isn't fully dead. There is actually one Blockbuster store left that's privately owned, that is basically there as a nostalgic tourist attraction. There was even a documentary made about this last ever Blockbuster store, which, ironically, was available to stream on Netflix. Before we get to the next chapter, I want to tell you about our video sponsor, Shipstation. When you run a business, every misplaced moment feels like a missed opportunity. But Shipstation gives e-commerce sellers more time to focus on the most important things by automating time-intensive shipping processes. Shipstation handles all your shipping and handling, and it works with all your storefronts, Amazon, eBay, Etsy, and more. And what I really like is they also give you deeply discounted shipping rates, normally reserved for Fortune 500 companies. So it's time to let go of all those shipping tasks. Shipstation can do it better and faster. Blockbuster. Sign up for a free 60-day trial today at shipstation.com/magnates and start saving time on every shipment. That's 2 whole months of shipping made quick and painless, and it's free to try. Just go to shipstation.com/magnates. Shipstation, make ship happen. And then once you've done that, let's get back to our story. Despite defeating Blockbuster, Netflix now had another problem to deal with: themselves. You see, in 2011, Netflix made what Reed has since called the biggest mistake in Netflix's history. At the time, Netflix was charging users $10 per month for a Netflix subscription, and for that, you got to rent out a physical DVD and you got access to their streaming service. Both were included as part of one single package. But since they'd launched their streaming service a few years ago, it had really grown in popularity, and it was clear to Reed that eventually Netflix would ditch the DVD business model completely and solely become a streaming service, since watching movies instantly over the internet was clearly way more convenient than mailing physical discs. So Reed decided to split up Netflix's DVD business and its streaming business. The streaming service would be on the Netflix website like normal, but if you wanted to rent DVDs, you had to go to a brand new website they created called Qwikster. This was the first mistake. Suddenly users who wanted both streaming and DVDs now had to use 2 separate websites with 2 separate logins. Next, Netflix told their customers that instead of $10 per month, they'd now be charged $8 per month for the DVD rentals, plus $8 per month for the streaming. Now, if you only wanted one or the other, that was great, but most people had gotten used to having both for $10. Now they were suddenly having to pay $16 for both. It was a massive out-of-the-blue price increase right in the middle of a recession where families were really struggling, and people were paying more for a worse product because now they had to have 2 separate accounts managed through 2 separate websites.
The huge mistake we made is, remember 2010, we're in the middle of a recession, still pretty deep, is we said, well, it's $8 is a good price for the DVD plan, it's a good price for the streaming plan, so the combination, which is $16, is the new price. And the old price was $10. So from the customer standpoint, one day the price went up 60% in the middle of a recession, and now they had to deal with 2 user interfaces instead of 1. So there was a huge uproar because we took 20 million US households in the middle of the 2008 recession and gave them a 60% price increase. So then the mob effect and crowd effect kicked in, and we went from love to hated very quickly.
It seemed like people hated everything about Qwikster, including the name. And so Reed got on camera to make a public apology and try to explain why they'd made the change.
We're making this video today to apologize in person, or at least on camera, for something that we did recently.
However, the apology just backfired even further. In fact, SNL even ended up making a parody of it.
But that's not all. We knew you loved Netflix because it was an easy-to-use website for all your movie needs. To make it better, we split it into 2 separate, slightly more confusing sites. Netflix for streaming video, and Qwikster, which will handle DVD rentals.
Did we spell a Qwikster in a normal way? No, we didn't.
No.
Qwik, annoying but easier.
Right. Yeah, and by the way, we know it's off-putting to see the CEO of a powerful company rocking a goatee and teal shirt, but trust us, we know what we're doing.
The whole debacle hurt Netflix's reputation, and over 1 million subscribers left because of it. As a result, they killed off the Qwikster brand completely and reverted back to keeping everything on the Netflix websites. However, despite this setback, Netflix moved on quickly and began working on yet another huge change. But this time, the change they were going to make would be an unimaginably huge success. Streaming movies and TV shows over the internet was great. Of all the business models Netflix had, this was clearly the best, and users loved it too. But there was one major risk. Netflix didn't own any of the content, they were just licensing it, which put Netflix in a vulnerable position if license holders ever changed their minds and didn't renew their agreement with Netflix. Now, in the past, when Netflix rented out physical DVDs, once Netflix had bought the DVD, they could do what they wanted with it. But with streaming content, if license holders didn't renew the deal, Netflix would lose that content from its streaming service. The solution was clear, but scary: original content. Netflix making their own shows and movies. Reed had always been open to the idea of producing original content. In fact, you may remember he actually tried to buy the rights to some small films back when Netflix was solely just a DVD rental service. But the issue had always been they just didn't have enough scale for creating their own content to be worth it. Because whether you have 10,000 subscribers or 10 million, the price of buying a film is the same. However, in the few years after Netflix started their streaming service and Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, Netflix subscribers and revenue had grown significantly every year, especially once Netflix started expanding internationally. And so now it seemed like they could potentially afford to try and make their own content. In 2011, a man named Ted Sarandos had the role of Chief Content Officer and was tasked with finding the first original show for Netflix to produce. And after months of searching, he returned with good news and bad news. The good news was that Ted had found a show called House of Cards that he felt had massive potential to be a huge hit. The bad news was that for Netflix to produce it, it would cost them around $100 million. That's because it was a show that needed a big budget to make, and also lots of production companies wanted the rights to it, including HBO. Now, for context, for Netflix to actually make a profit on this $100 million investment, they basically needed to bring in around 500,000 new users who stayed subscribed for 2 years each. So buying the rights to this show was an extremely risky and expensive gamble that Reed would later call a bet the company moment. But Netflix took the plunge and bought the rights to House of Cards, and they began creating it as their first original TV show. The show premiered in 2013 and was a massive success, becoming the first online-only TV series to receive an Emmy nomination. It was clear to Netflix they needed to double down on this new strategy of producing original content. The main reason for this was that Netflix now had other competitors in the streaming market, like Hulu, and so other content producers had stopped giving Netflix an exclusive license to stream their movies and TV shows. Netflix knew more streaming services would soon pop up as well, and that they needed a way to differentiate themselves, and having exclusive shows that nobody else had was the best way to do that. Netflix also realized that even though creating original content was expensive up front, in the long run, paying licensing fees every year may actually end up being more expensive, especially as some studios were starting to charge Netflix higher and higher licensing fees once they saw how much money Netflix was making. So Netflix dived into original content more and more, every year upping their production budget further. They initially focused more on TV shows, as they're typically a bit cheaper to make, and also they figured if people got hooked on a show, they'd stay subscribed to Netflix for future seasons. But soon, Netflix was throwing money at all kinds of different content, including some big budget movies. In fact, it even became a bit of a joke just how much content Netflix seemed to be making.
Netflix, you're greenlit. Who am I speaking with?
Yes, hello. We have an idea for a show that we think would be great for Netflix.
Okay, great. Would you like a pilot or just go straight to an order of 6 episodes?
When Netflix first started spending hundreds of millions on original content, many questioned the strategy. But as more and more streaming services later started competing with them and pulled their own content off Netflix, it became clearer that making original content was clearly Netflix's best option. And to be fair to Netflix, they're outspending competitors, outspending Hollywood studios, and in 2021 alone, they spent $17 billion on content. And Reed just wants to keep upping the amount Netflix spends on originals even further.
You don't think you're going to ultimately have to take down spend?
No, we plan on taking spend up quite a bit.
As a result, Netflix has won countless awards and even become the first streaming platform to get an Oscar nomination for one of its originals.
No one goes to the cinema, no one really watches network TV. Everyone's watching Netflix. This show should just be me coming out going, well done Netflix, you win, everything, good night. But no, we got to drag it out for 3 hours.
Netflix also had an advantage in terms of the amount of data they had about their users and their viewing preferences, which helped them make decisions of what type of shows to make and what to renew. Another advantage for Netflix was that unlike traditional networks, who typically operate in a single country, Netflix had users in pretty much every country in the world. So when they produced a hit show in one country, they could easily distribute it to their subscribers in other countries too. For example, we saw this with the Korean show Squid Game, which became a massive hit all around the world.
We have a show, Qwikster, out of Sweden, crime thriller. Did super well in Sweden. Of course, you expect that or hope for that, but it did 15 times more viewing in the rest of the world cumulatively than it did Sweden. So we've got this huge opportunity there.
And so for a while, it seemed like Netflix was going to be a hugely dominant force in entertainment. Of course, in present day, Netflix's position looks much less certain, but we'll get to that soon. What I think is really interesting though is that the company has managed to completely pivot their business model multiple times. We can see here the 4 main stages of Netflix. Number 1 was selling and renting DVDs by mail. Number 2 was their DVD subscription service. Number 3 was their video on demand streaming platform. And number 4 is content production. What's crazy to me is that Netflix is older than Google. This is a company that's been around a long time and genuinely had a huge impact on multiple industries. Not to mention the fact they quite literally changed the way we consume shows, since they pretty much pioneered the concept of binge watching by dropping whole series of a new show all at once. So the real question we need to ask is, how have they managed to innovate and stay relevant for so long? And the answer was not what I expected. Before we get to the next part of the video, I want to ask you a very quick favor. If you're enjoying this video so far, and you want to see more mini-movies and documentaries like this, please consider turning on the notification bell so YouTube tells you about my future videos. By the way, my name's John, but the channel is called Magnates Media because a magnate is someone with a lot of wealth, influence, and business success. And those are the 3 main themes of this channel. I've got some big plans in the works, so I'd love it if you turn on notifications and join me for the ride. Thank you for your support, you are a legend, and now let's get back to the story. When you first join Netflix as an employee, you're shown a short presentation that includes the following sentence: adequate performance gets a generous severance package. In other words, if you're just average at your job, you'll quickly get fired. This is because Netflix's CEO, Reed Hastings, strongly believes in the concept of talent density. To illustrate what this means, we need to look at a famous experiment, where students were divided into random teams to complete various tasks. However, some teams included a paid actor who was told to be either lazy or overly negative about the work and not take the task seriously. In dozens of trials repeated over several months, the group with the underperformer did worse than the other teams by 30 to 40%. Meaning, just having one team member who wasn't pulling their weight massively affected the performance of the rest of the group as well. It was like their poor performance was contagious and brought down the enthusiasm and quality of work for everyone in the team. If you've ever been in a group project at school or work, you may have experienced this yourself. And if you haven't experienced it, maybe you were the underperformer in the group. However, the reverse is true too. If you have a team full of only top performers, a team of talented people, all equally wanting to work hard and do well and achieve incredible results, it brings out the best in each other. This is why Netflix are quite ruthless about firing anyone who isn't an A player, because otherwise they bring down the performance level of everyone else. Netflix also believes in the rockstar principle, which is that top employees don't just outperform other people by maybe twice as much, it's more like the top talent outperforms average employees by 10 times or maybe 100 times as much. So Netflix believes one absolute rockstar employee who's amazing at their job is better than 10 people who are just decent at their job. Quality over quantity. So in order to try and attract that top talent, Netflix say they pay top of market salaries. Basically, they'll pay a lot of money to get what they believe are the absolute best candidates available. They'd rather have less employees, but higher average talent per employee. Or in other words, higher talent density. This then has the added bonus that the top employees generally want to work with other top employees. So once you build a culture like this, it automatically attracts other top performers. However, Netflix is very open about the fact they're a team, not a family.
So the analogy we use a lot is professional sports. You know, if you want to have world-class and World Cup winning teams, you need to assemble an amazing group of people at every position.
Basically, they'll work together to support each other, but ultimately, Netflix wants the best people in each position within the business. Meaning if you stop performing well, you could be replaced. You're fighting for your position. But Netflix believes the top performers want that, to be on a winning top level team. Now, obviously, every company wants the best employees. So how do Netflix actually try to enforce this? Well, they have something called the Keeper Test.
What's different about Netflix is the Keeper Test. And what we say is for managers is, would their people, if they were leaving to go to another company, would we try to change their mind to keep them? We would fight to keep them. And if we fight to keep them, great. If there's someone that you wouldn't fight to keep, we say give them a generous severance package, 4 to 6 months of compensation now, and let them go find a place that's a better match. And let us find a great new talent that may be one of those great people.
Basically, if a manager wouldn't mind if an employee on their team left the company, then they should fire them. As brutal as that may sound, Netflix offer a minimum of 4 months severance pay. So even if the employee hasn't been there long, they'll still get a big payout if they're fired. The reason for this is firstly so Netflix don't get any lawsuits for unfair dismissal, but secondly, so managers don't feel guilty about firing people if it's not working out, as they know the employee will get a big payoff. However, another reason why Netflix have tried to develop this culture of only keeping high performers is that then you can have less rules and restrictions in place, which leads to more creativity and innovation. For example, Netflix don't track how much vacation time employees take, as long as they get their work done. They also don't have an expense policy. They just tell employees to act in Netflix's best interests and make their own decisions, even for big purchases. This empowers employees, gives them responsibility, and means Netflix can act faster without getting slowed down with bureaucracy, like managers approving every little decision. Reed has a saying that if you dummy-proof things too much, you end up with only dummies working for you, and that you stifle creativity and innovation if people don't have freedom. Netflix also shares all of their internal plans and secrets with literally every employee at the company, even if they're a brand new low-ranking employee. This is very different to most companies where information is segregated and you only know what you need to know to do your specific job. But Netflix tells all their employees about their long-term plans, and they even share their quarterly financial results with all their staff before they're released publicly, which very few companies do because it would be disastrous if that information got leaked early. But Netflix does it as a sign of trust in their employees. However, perhaps the weirdest part of all of the Netflix culture is their policy of radical honesty, where everyone is encouraged to be brutally honest with their feedback and suggestions to other employees. And this is true for lower level employees too. They're encouraged to say if they disagree with their team leader or any of the managers in the company. Even Reed himself, as the CEO, asks employees to critique him with constructive criticism so he can try to improve his own performance. There was even one incident where an employee told him in the politest way possible he needed to shower, as Reed had been working so hard he'd stayed at the office overnight and was starting to smell. Now, if you're thinking, wait, doesn't this culture create some problems? Then the answer is yes, it absolutely does. Firstly, giving employees so much freedom over spending Netflix's money has obviously led to some abuse. Like, there was one employee who spent over $100,000 on personal travel trips using his company credit card before someone realized. Secondly, the unlimited vacation policy sometimes leads to people being afraid to take any vacation at all, since they don't have a specific allotted amount of vacation days. Plus, when you consider the high performance Netflix demands and how they'll fire you for average work, it's understandable people are reluctant to take time off. Thirdly, sharing all that inside information with employees has led to internal company secrets getting leaked to the public and competitors. And their radical honesty policy has undoubtedly led to arguments. There was even an article about Netflix that talked about a culture of fear. The headline said, employees describe a climate of fear where peers are encouraged to rate each other, emails are sent slamming former workers, and managers feel under constant pressure to fire people. It sounds brutal, right? Well, the truth is, the Netflix culture would suit some people, but not others. However, Reed's core belief is that if you have really amazingly talented employees and you give them this level of responsibility and freedom, generally the gains outweigh the losses. Reed uses the analogy of a jazz band, where the musicians all know the overall structure of the song, but there's freedom for improvisation and spontaneity from individuals, where the musicians can riff off one another. Ultimately, Reed believes in business their biggest risk isn't making a mistake, it's failing to attract top talent, invent new products, or change direction quickly enough when the situation changes. He'd rather try things and they fail, rather than not innovate enough at all. And looking at what happened with Blockbuster, maybe he's onto something there. However, if I was making this video a couple of years ago, this is where the story would end. It would be a success story with a happy ending for Netflix. But that is no longer the case. Netflix is currently in trouble, and this time they may not be able to fix that.
We are right in the midst of the streaming wars.
We are. There's a lot of competitors all throughout the world. All the major media companies are investing in their own services.
I do not think that they're going to have a great quarter or have anything great to say about, new subscribers.
Netflix has become a victim of their own success. They led the way with streaming, and then just about everyone who makes movies or TV shows realized they wanted to get in on streaming too. In fact, not only does Netflix now have to compete against so many different networks who've launched their own streaming services, but they've also got to battle against giant tech companies like Apple and Amazon who've got into streaming and producing original content as well. And of course, it's definitely not ideal that Amazon as their competitor is the one who is powering Netflix using Amazon Web Services. All this competition is clearly bad news for Netflix in multiple ways. Firstly, of course, the simple fact that more competition obviously means consumers are more likely to pick a rival service instead of Netflix, or perhaps subscribe to Netflix for a couple of months, but then cancel and switch to a different service for another few months. However, the real bad news for Netflix was that all these companies started pulling their content off Netflix to use on their own service instead. Netflix used to have so much content from Disney and HBO and all these other networks, and now they've pulled it all off Netflix for their own streaming sites instead. As a result, Netflix has lost a lot of big shows like The Office and Friends. They've lost movies from Marvel and Disney. And whilst Netflix do of course still have some third-party content they license, it's nowhere near as cheap for them to license it as it was when they first started. However, despite all of the competition, until fairly recently, Netflix still looked to be in a good position, thanks to all the original content they're making. Plus, Netflix was one of the few companies who massively benefited from the pandemic, because suddenly the entire world was stuck at home looking for stuff to watch, and so Netflix's subscribers grew substantially. But in 2022, Netflix announced for the first time in a decade that they'd lost subscribers. And worse still, they admitted it's going to get harder to grow, and they expect to lose even more subscribers. Netflix's share price then had a truly remarkable implosion. In just a couple of days, they lost $50 billion off their market cap, and Netflix share prices still continued to plummet rapidly. Things only got worse for Netflix when they started talking about their new plans to try and make more money. For example, Netflix said they wanted to crack down on password sharing. This is a complete U-turn on Netflix's strategy when subscribers were growing. Netflix even once tweeted, "Love is sharing a password." But now their growth is slowing, they seem to want to make sure people aren't sharing passwords with friends or other households. This was made even less popular when Netflix decided to also raise their prices again. There does seem to be a worrying parallel here with Blockbuster, which is that when growth slows, they tried to squeeze more money out of existing customers, which resulted in making the service worse, instead of innovating to make the service better. Likewise, Netflix is considering introducing a cheaper subscription plan option that has ads on it. So you'd still be paying to watch Netflix, but you'd be getting ads as well. This idea was also met with a lot of criticism, because even though Netflix will continue to offer an ad-free option as well, you'll be paying a higher price for that. Now, when a lot of people hear these proposed changes, it's easy to think Netflix are basically just being greedy and driving people away. But to be fair to Netflix, it's not like they want to remove the good shows, it's just they've lost the license rights. It's not that they want to annoy users with ads, it's just they're trying to find a way to keep subscribers who want lower price subscriptions. And as for increasing the price in the first place, well, they want to raise more money to invest in making more original content, since they've lost so many licenses to other people's shows. I think the more justified criticism of Netflix is firstly the quality of shows they're making, or as SNL put it,
everything. Here's a look at one of our actual pitch meetings.
So, this show is about a girl named Ginny.
Yes, here's money. Go. Make them.
Netflix has been throwing absurd amounts of money into content, like $100 million for Jerry Seinfeld comedy specials, $20 million each to Ryan Reynolds, The Rock, and Gal Gadot for starring in Red Notice. Netflix have literally had movies that have cost hundreds of millions of dollars each, and that wasn't really an issue when Netflix subscribers kept growing so rapidly. But once subscriber growth slows, the question becomes, is this sustainable? Do they need to double down on truly quality content instead of just pumping out quantity? And then even when Netflix does make a good show, they often seem to cancel it too early, and people are less likely to get into a show if they know it's been cut short without a proper ending. If you look at people's comments on Netflix, the sentiment towards them has definitely changed recently. To many, it feels like their value proposition has got worse. Less selection, higher prices. Which is why they need to get their success ratio higher with their original shows. Because many of their competitors have much bigger back catalogs of content that people already love. When Disney Plus launched, they set a target of 60 to 90 million subscribers by 2024. In reality, they hit 90 million by early 2022, meaning they're way ahead of schedule and doing doing even better than expected. To make matters worse for Netflix, there have even been issues internally lately, with some employees walking out on the company in protest over some of the content Netflix produced, which basically led to Netflix telling employees to leave if they're offended by its content. However, let's play devil's advocate for a moment here. Is Netflix really in as much trouble as some people are making out? There's a lot of talk about the end of Netflix, but the reality is they're still the largest streaming service in the world by a wide margin. They currently have around 220 million subscribers. Plus, the fact Netflix's subscriber count was down slightly for the first time in a decade is also down to a couple of other reasons. For example, Netflix suspended their service in Russia because of the war in Ukraine, which caused Netflix to lose 700,000 subscribers. If they hadn't done this, then Netflix subscribers would have still been up from the previous quarter, and we wouldn't have had so many headlines about Netflix losing subscribers. Secondly, Netflix saw a massive increase in subscribers during the pandemic, so it's not actually surprising that they've dipped a little now that things are getting back to normal, because not as many people are watching TV. Their subscriber levels are still higher than they were before the pandemic. And thirdly, with inflation rising so rapidly, it's also not surprising some people would have cancelled their subscription. These are difficult times for some people, but just because they've currently stopped their Netflix subscription doesn't mean Netflix is now doomed to fail. So basically, I think whilst Netflix are inevitably going to lose some of their dominance with all this competition, it's hardly the death of Netflix like some people are claiming. Sure, Netflix is in a difficult situation right now, and things could definitely get a lot worse if they don't make some changes, but that's what they've always done, and so I wouldn't necessarily bet against them.
You know, we've gone through a lot of changes, and we've always figured them out one by one. We lead by a significant margin in streaming, and streaming is continuing to grow around the world.
What is pretty clear though is that the streaming war is bad for consumers. In most industries, it's good for customers when there's lots of competition, because it forces businesses to make their product or service better or cheaper, so customers choose them instead of a competitor. But with streaming, actually it was much better for consumers when Netflix had a near monopoly on streaming, because then everything was all in one place for an affordable price. Now everything's fragmented across so many different services. Streaming was once meant to be a cheap and easy alternative to cable, but now to watch everything you want, you need potentially hundreds of dollars a month to get all the different subscription services, and use multiple different user interfaces to try and find what you want. And so for most people, they now have to miss out on a lot of shows they want to watch. It's kind of frustrating if someone tells you about a great show, but you need a whole new subscription service to watch it. Which means talking about shows with other people isn't going to be quite the same if everyone's got different subscriptions. Of course, you could argue that all these different streaming services throwing millions and millions of dollars into original content does mean more shows are being produced overall, which means more variety, so maybe it's not all bad. But as more and more separated streaming services pop up and prices continue to increase, it will be interesting if this has an effect on piracy. However, from Netflix's perspective, whilst it's true they're losing market share to other streaming services, the streaming market is growing overall. They may have a smaller cut of the pie, but the pie is getting bigger, as there's almost certainly a lot more people who are going to start streaming over the next few years as traditional TV declines. Plus, more than a third of the world haven't even used the internet yet, so there's evidently room for growth. Perhaps the bigger issue for Netflix is not so much other streaming services, but simply the general battle for attention. Reed himself has commented before that he views their competition as all forms of entertainment, even things like video games.
We compete with Fortnite more than HBO, meaning that Fortnite gets a lot more hours of viewing. And ultimately, it's about competing for those hours of viewing.
Of course, this means Netflix's competition even includes Magnate's Media, so please remember to subscribe since I'm going to need all the help I can get. But what Reed's saying here is definitely true, and in particular, there is an argument that TikTok is a really serious threat to Netflix. TikTok gets all its content produced for free from its users, in contrast to the $17 billion Netflix is spending this year alone on original content. TikTok also has much more data on its users, and thus its recommendation algorithm is better. Plus, you don't have to actually choose what to watch on TikTok. It just autoplays, unlike Netflix where you can find yourself scrolling and scrolling, trying to find something you want to watch. Plus, you then have to commit maybe 20 minutes to an episode, unlike TikTok where the content is typically under 30 seconds, so you can watch as long as you want. Now, personally, I don't think the rise of short-form content is a good thing. I don't like TikTok or the way it operates. But from a business point of view, TikTok is doing incredibly. As this graph shows, TikTok's parent company ByteDance was well behind Netflix in revenue a few years ago. Now, they make twice as much. YouTube is also clearly a huge threat to Netflix. And one of the most fascinating examples of this is that Mr. Beast's Squid Game video got more views when it launched than the actual Squid Game TV show. And of course, YouTube didn't pay a penny in production costs. My point here is that to view Netflix's problems solely through the lens of a streaming war isn't actually the full picture. This is an attention war. And even though TikTok and YouTube sometimes get labeled as social media, they're not really. You don't tend to interact with friends like you would on Facebook or Instagram. Your feed is fully tailored to you, and you're just consuming video content like you would on Netflix. Ultimately though, whilst the future does look uncertain for Netflix right now, this is definitely not the end of the Netflix story. And there are also plenty of lessons we can learn from Netflix, like focusing on doing one thing really well instead of diversifying and spreading yourself too thin, or looking ahead to the future and pivoting to adapt to changes in technology, no matter how well things are working in the present. And so it's gonna be fascinating to see whether Netflix manages to do that once again. Having said all that, if Netflix really does fail to innovate and they end up going bankrupt, since there is technically still one Blockbuster store left, it would be a pretty bittersweet irony if Blockbuster actually managed to outlive Netflix. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through Netflix's history, and if you want to understand more on why TikTok is a real threat, not just to Netflix, but many other businesses as well, click here to watch my documentary on the insane story of TikTok. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for watching this video to the end. You are a legend, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.